So next up, we have Paul again. And then we also have Rebecca Harned, who is the director at NAPSG. And we already talked about National Alliance for Public Safety GIS. And they're going to talk a little bit about the NAPSG Foundation, but also about lessons learned from Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rebecca Harned. I'm the Director for National and Federal Programs at NAPSG Foundation. And so just on behalf of the organization, I want to thank all of you for coming together for this. There's a lot of new faces and folks that haven't been engaged in our efforts in the past, and we're really happy to have you. And I also want to thank the SAR GIS Working Group, because this truly is a grassroots effort. Our kind of programmatic staff don't really get involved in this event, and that's really deliberate on our end, because we really want this to be from the ground up, which is essentially all of you who do this every day. And then I also want to thank Esri for hosting us again this year, and just in general for the partnership that they provide around some of the technology and data issues for search and rescue. So just a couple things about NAPSG. We're started over 10 years ago. With us. We were formed as an alliance of the national associations in public safety. So that was very intentional in order to drive a unification of effort around the use and adoption and implementation of geospatial technology, advanced tech, and data and interoperability across the public safety community. So search and rescue is one of those very important groups, but we also work with law enforcement, emergency management, public health, mass care, kind of the full spectrum of public safety. So just a little bit of background around us, about us. Groups like the International Association of Fire Chiefs. We now have a great partnership with NASAR, National Association for Search and Rescue, Major City Chiefs of Police, IAEM, International Association of Emergency Managers. So they all kind of come together. We have partnerships with different associations on different efforts. And then we also work with the federal community. So I know we've got a couple of federal agency representatives here. We do a lot of work with agencies, obviously DHS and FEMA. We've got Park Service here. So just a little bit about us. And that's all great from a national perspective. But again, what really matters is the locals, and that's really kind of where our focus is and where the rubber meets the road on a lot of issues. So we have about a network of 23,000 local, county, state, tribal, territorial public safety. Some of that does bleed into nonprofits, because certainly search and rescue is and oftentimes run by nonprofits. So is mass care, and in some cases health and other sectors. So just a little bit of background about us. And if you haven't checked out our website, I encourage you to, because you might find some really valuable tools that help to answer some of the questions we were talking about today. I think things like resource typing for GIS resources came up. We have some standardized definition around some of those things for GIS. In the interim, while FEMA works on rolling out the national qualification system and things like that. So some good resources. Yes, this is kind of our resource library. I think we also talked about that need for a common language and symbology for search and rescue. We've basically developed a standard used across public safety. I say standard with a small s. We are working with ANSI and APCO on actually formalizing this as a standard. But you can kind of you click in, there's dynamic web services in each of these. Each symbol, it has its own separate API service, so you can bring it in. Each download package, you can download style sheets, PNGs, JPEGs, all kinds of really cool stuff to enable consistent communication around incidents. And that's really the driver here.
And we'll get hands-on with this tool tomorrow. So
yeah, and what's important here is, believe me, this is like the one issue that everybody can never agree on. And so while I realize people are like, oh, why does it look like this? This was developed by and for public safety, so we don't just do this in a vacuum. This is developed by a working group of primarily local first responders that contribute to that. So there's a little bit of background there, it's all free. There's a plethora of other resources available through here. This is where some of that resource typing around GIS is available. This was developed to be discipline agnostic, meaning regardless of what public safety discipline or sector you might be in, this is intended to be generic. We're working to refine this. It's an ongoing process. It does follow the NIMS resource typing and position qualification structure and format. I used to work in FEMA, so I was able to kind of take the concept and adapt it where we needed to. If you want to, kind of get a sense for what's in there, and then I think that, there's a lot of other resources. Explore some great stuff for U.S. National Grid, which I think you'll be getting into a little bit more as well. So just to kind of point you to what's available. And with that, I'd like to kind of talk a little bit about what happened in Harvey and Irma and Maria with regards to GIS technology and specifically the SAR mission. But I've got a couple questions I want to ask you guys first. How many of you are operators or decision makers in your agencies or in your search and rescue teams? Can I see a raise of hands to get a sense? Okay. How many are technologists or GIS techs doing the? Okay. So almost an even split. All right. Okay.
Try for 50-50.
How many are both?
Yes. Okay. All right. A couple. Great. And how many of you either did like boots on the ground support for any of the more recent hurricanes or the wildfires recently in California? Okay. All right, excellent, great. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we kind of observed across the field. We had the, certainly the opportunity to be able to work with a number of state USAR teams, a number of just local SAR that was either deployed or just pre-positioned for landfall, as well as working with some of the crowdsourcing community, and then also on the federal interagency coordination side. So it's a pretty dynamic experience that we worked through on these 3 incidents in particular. So this is just kind of some of the geospatial support that was provided. I think this is relatively specific to Irma, but essentially what we first did was support Harvey. Then we rapidly took what we were gaining from insights from Harvey, and we kind of made changes and adapted courses of action prior to landfall for Irma. So it was a pretty dynamic experience. Some of that carried over into Maria, but not entirely, because there's a lot of different challenges in terms of just basic mapping capabilities of data in Puerto Rico, as well as the disconnected environment that was not present in Harvey and Irma. So they had very kind of some variances in that respect. We provided a number of different kind of support. So did anybody hear about like the whole Highfeld for Harvey thing? And Highfeld for okay. So that was something NAPSG was, I'd say, heavily involved in. We were not necessarily the one curating that open data, but we worked very closely with DHS and FEMA in developing that framework for it. I'd say it's a really good and important move in terms of the use of open data and making incident data available in as real time as possible in a way that was readily discoverable. I'm obviously completely aware of some of the challenges with these sites that we stood up. So they certainly were not end all be all, but it was the first time this had ever been done for a specific incident. The big issue that we were trying to solve is whether it's, HDDS or, some of the other portals, FEMA's open data page, all of this incident-specific data that was becoming available really, really quickly was disparate across all of these different portals. So in some cases, search and rescue teams and others that were going in saying, where can I get what I need really quickly? There historically hadn't been that one-stop shop. In Harvey in particular, this was more of a need than it was in Irma, and there's a reason for that. Texas didn't already have an open data portal specific to disasters, right? Florida did. And so there was kind of differences there. The other issue is that a ton of data and apps and maps get developed by the crowd and by other people. Well, who curates those to say, what's best available? How do I rely on some of this information? And that's always a real challenge. You take imagery as a great example, right? Before and after, those slider apps, right, that show you the before and after imagery. Something usually like 10 or 15 of those, as soon as imagery comes out, will like get stood up. But how do you know that it's like the best available imagery and all of those types of issues? So those are some of the things that we were trying to solve through this effort. Some of the challenges that we learned with these national data assets, in large part, both the pre-staging of the most relevant, I say infrastructure data, but there was also building outlines and some other data that's not necessarily infrastructure data, was that none of it was clipped to the area. So it was still very heavy from a technology perspective and a data perspective for teams deploying, needing to download what they need to download. But this was the environment that we were able to serve up things like the USMG map books that Brian spoke about into a common place that was readily discoverable, right, and accessible to different search and rescue teams. I would say the majority of the usage of Highfeld for Harvey, as well as Highfeld for Irma, was used to support the SAR mission specifically. Certainly there was usage by, federal agencies, and that's wonderful to support decision making. But from an actual boots on the ground standpoint, the primary usage was there. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, tomorrow we'll work a little bit with we should probably cover this terminology now, but base data, the stuff that's there before there's a disaster, and incident data, which can be the stuff that happened to your base data, it's been damaged, or it could be things like the USAR damage assessment, it could be your clue log. So incident data and base data are really important terminology to get on the same page with. Tomorrow we'll play with some of the open base data sets, which is great. So locations of cell phone towers, nursing homes, etc. What Rebecca is explaining is this was the first time really that we created, or we as a community created an open data portal for the incident data. So, okay, we know where the cell phone towers were, but what's their status now? So it was a really new concept, and that's why I had to email people like Scott and say, hey, did you know this is out there? I'm trying to pick the one or two things I think are important to a USAR team and send it to you because it's brand new.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and so this is the primary Highfeld. So this is always available. This is 492 different national data sets for different types of infrastructure assets. So if you're not familiar with Highfeld, I'd encourage you to play around with Highfeld. But with the Highfeld for Harvey and Irma, what that was intended to was to focus that on what is the most important data and information for this incident and the incident specific data. So things like in that case, when damage assessment data was coming out, that would get posted up there. So some of the actual live different flood extents, things like that for that type of event. So a little bit of a difference. And this is always available. So it's something you can use from a preparedness standpoint, and if you're doing any kind of mapping for pre-scripted missions, things like that, it's a really great resource. Okay, so then the other thing that was particularly important, I'd say this was very important for Harvey because of the nature of Harvey, they couldn't fly imagery for almost 7 days after landfall because of the nature of the event, right? It was looping back around, there was dense cloud cover, they couldn't get the right kind of imagery. So what we worked on is standing up what is kind of, I think, the first time this has been done for an incident as well.
In the States. We did this in New Zealand. We had a flood, which was relatively small compared to what you get here, but they don't have the same resources we have for dealing with inland flooding. So I knew for the first 2 days of this flooding incident, which was actually Tropical Cyclone Debbie, that the photos that responders and especially people up in helicopters were taking with their smartphones were geotagged, and they were pretty much just going to show some of their buddies or maybe their ops chief, hey, look, this area is real bad. But we weren't leveraging the geospatial aspects of it. So we stood up in New Zealand for that particular cyclone, this app, which was mostly responders. I would call it responder source data. This was the first time we actually said the scale of Hurricane Harvey is so big, and there's so much information being just lost to Twitter and Facebook and on responders' phones. We wanted to leverage the fact that a lot of these photos are geotagged or at least geo-mentioned. So maybe through showing it, it'll make more sense. But this is an app where you can add a photo manually. So this could be from your smartphone or it could be from your computer. You don't need to sign in. It's a nice to have, but you can continue anonymously. And you basically just drag a photo here, enter a description, and it appears on the map. So that's one way to use it, is actually out in the field with photos that you have. But if you look at some of the photos that are in here, I have a favorite one. This one. Who is this photo taken by? You can guess. This person. Well, who did she get it from? She got it from a reporter. So a reporter posted this originally. The reporter didn't geotag their photo. Twitter does not geotag your photos by default anymore. It's a setting you have to turn on. But what's in this picture? An intersection. So what we did is we created a little expert source community of GIS core volunteers. They're partners of ours and Esri, where they're geospatial people. They think geospatially. They're sitting all across the world hoping they could help. So rather than have them crowdsource, we had them vet some of the data coming in, and they take the photos and put them on here so we don't lose them. So I know there's at least one person from Houston here. Yep. Where's Aaron? Do we lose Aaron? Oh, Aaron. What neighborhood did you live in? Where do you live in? Down here. So the flood modeling data and the post-event imagery and the USAR damage assessment, that'll all come in time, but this was available from day 1, day 2, day 3, and now it's still there. We can go back and kind of relive the incident and understand what happened there.
And it was actually being used in even the state EOCs, which was for both Hurricane Harvey as well as for Irma. So there's a separate one stood up for Irma. And it was giving them that lens because imagery wasn't available for so long to be able to start to understand where they need to start going in and being able to assign inspectors and whatnot from a damage assessment standpoint. So it was pretty profound for in terms of the actual use of, you know, this kind of crowd imagery.
That's
right.
Aaron's photo. Yeah.
How cool.
So the majority of the photos didn't come from people like Aaron.
No, yeah.
Yeah. So thank you for people like Aaron for actually contributing. And thank you to all the volunteers who helped kind of do this. What we were seeing on our end at NAPSG was I kind of just set it up. I wrote a quick SOP. We shared it. And all of a sudden, it wasn't just that story map. We could bring that into other responders' dashboards as intel. So it's just another tool. The way to make something like this successful is GIS people are very competitive. So I asked GIS people when they log in, when they go to submit a photo, to log in with their username so we could little leaderboard. I didn't like push this out on Twitter, but we could all access it. And I can see some people in the room here. Looks like Hillary, David, and others. The other people clearly were really passionate about doing this. Maybe they have relatives there, but they're a GIS person in Seattle and they want to contribute. This was a way to do this. And I have to say, we sort of did it on the fly, knowing that it would make a difference, but having to make up some of the rules as we go.
We didn't really know how it was going to get used. We had some ideas of what some of the issues were, but it picked up very quickly. And I think Irma was, since we sort of proved the model, I guess you could say, and Harvey, when it carried over to Irma, it was a lot more impactful. So like the state EOCs in Georgia and Florida, immediately prior to landfall, we're asking, okay, do you have the app stood up? Because we're going to get it up in the EOC. It's going to be constantly running so that we can actually see that ditch and that information about the incident from the ground level in as real time as possible. So it was pretty impactful, particularly in Irma, I think a little bit more so than in Harvey, but just because there was already, the state was ready, they weren't ready to accept it. It was also being used in some of the other EOCs in the local and county level to help inform decision making. And that's kind of the essence of it. Anything else you want to add on that one?
No, I think sometimes a photo is all you need. Over time, you're going to need more intel, right? You're going to need the things that come from the FEMA USAR task force. How many of the houses were damaged? How many victims did you rescue? But this was just a way that a human mind could quickly understand, but instead of just looking at photos, seeing their location.
And the Hurricane Maria one also proved to be quite valuable because that was also a really tough area where they didn't have a lot of pre-existing imagery as well. That one was my understanding from some of the SAR teams that were deployed for Maria. They were actively using the Maria app as well in the field to understand kind of how they covered some of these areas and whatnot.
Yeah, and there was no jurisdiction. So right. As we got more information, like the island of Dominica, was really totaled. And the information was probably up on social media one way or another before it actually got to the teams coming in directly. So it was just another way to make it a bit easier to get that information out. So
the next one?
I think we'll move on to
Yeah, okay. Yeah, this is a
The
really good
solid
one.
part.
How many of you are familiar with some of the kind of, should we say, crowdsourcing challenges in Harvey? Have you guys heard a little bit about what happened there already? Okay, so one of the major issues was that during Harvey, obviously it was a long-standing event, it rained over many, many days. The telephone lines into 911 centers were completely at capacity. People couldn't get through. In many cases, they couldn't get through to their Coast Guard numbers. And so what started to happen is people, citizens, started to post SOS requests on social media. So using Twitter and Facebook to say, I need, I'm here, I need rescued, I've got so many people here. So all of these SOS messages were getting handled through social media, which is not optimal for the obvious reasons, right? You also, the issue with that is you don't have any backward tracing to say, did this request actually get executed? But regardless, it was the reality in Harvey. It was not the same reality in Irma, but it was for Harvey. And so really quickly, an organization at the time that was called Harvey Rescue rapidly stood up. They were completely volunteer-based, NGO document, and they started collecting all this information about all these SOS requests coming in through social media. Then the Coast Guard actually started to use that to process requests and they were actually adding their own requests that were coming through to this Google spreadsheet. And then they were adjudicating those requests based on if they've been handled or whatnot directly in this, essentially a crowdsourced platform.
So here's just an example from a current mission in Puerto Rico where they've switched from rescue to looking at resource requests and deployment. But they're using the same technique. They're going onto social media and mining the data and then putting it onto a map. Whereas initially they were using a big Google Doc, trying to get geospatial information into a Google Doc and then maybe getting it mapped. And after losing our minds trying to help SAR teams ingest the data, with them how to properly map it in the first place, and that made a big difference.
Let's go back to the dashboard though, because I think there's some really important things to talk about here, because one of the things that we worked to do, yeah, that one. Okay, this is a good one, right? So this is where this wasn't the social media.
Yeah, I don't think we have a snap of that one.
So we don't have that particular snapshot up. But basically what we did was take them all in, give them some level of aggregated analysis so they're not just looking at a spreadsheet and they have a sense of how many of these SOS requests through social media have they been capturing, how many have been completed, meaning, actually looking at that, and then where are some of the search and rescue resources and where are some of the outstanding needs. Prior to that, all they had was a Google spreadsheet. It was essentially a dashboard more or less along the same vein. This was built using Web App Builder, but you could use what you want. But the key thing was determining some of the metrics. This is not the same one for this purpose, and we can talk a little bit about this one. Was more from the field data collection side for search and rescue teams. So it's kind of an interesting problem. The same issue did permeate a little bit in Irma, but not to the same extent, because you obviously didn't have the same volume of SOS and actual rescue requests coming in that you had in Harvey. So by nature, they were a little bit different. Well, one thing that I found fascinating as well is I just literally flew in today from LA. One of the companies I was meeting out there with is actually starting a new social media application. And one of the things that they're going to be looking at doing is the ability for the crowd to aggregate into a common event all of their content and posts, right? So instead of saying they're just putting to a Facebook feed or a SAR, or I'm sorry, a Twitter feed, they would actually be contributing to a common discussion, essentially. So it would actually help to put a lot of order to chaos when an event arises prior to it. So you kind of almost establish, I don't know exactly the ins and outs of it. They're a little proprietary about it since they haven't released it yet. But they're really, really committed to making sure that their application can serve public safety and disaster management. And what was funny was I was like, okay, well, you're going to have location services? And they're like, no, we're not going to have location services. And I was like, oh my God. So it was like, so all of a sudden what became a bottom of the list priority after the discussion is the top of the list. So I think my point to you is that what you see working in these events and what we came out of the recent events is already changing, right? Technology is already it's already moving. And so we can think about it and we can take these as examples, but to acknowledge the fact that most likely by the next time there's something the equivalent of a Hurricane Harvey, there's going to be something even, frankly, better and more manageable and more useful from a disaster management, particularly a search and rescue perspective coming out there. That's just one little example. So the other thing that we did in Harvey was basically stood up at the request of a couple of search and rescue teams some different field data applications. It was very much a prototype type effort. It was, say, they needed it really quickly. We stood it up. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about those prior to getting into the Irma ones.
Yeah, if you think of the iron sites as a phase 1 assessment, like we just need to know where USAR went and what their actions were and what they saw. What these teams were asking for was maybe a phase 2 capability. So, okay, we're done with rescues, or this area is safe. We want to add a little more intelligence to the map. And so the same tools that you'll use as a clue log or other apps tomorrow, Survey 123, we just turned into, you know, a phase 2 damage assessment. So we just made a form for them. But more important than the form was the intel you get out of it. And so so we created sort of a platform for some of these USAR teams that wanted to do that.
Right.
In particular, the one that's number 3 is actually a form from Florida. It says, I think we called it, the image assessment snapshot, because it's before the actual data assessment goes through. But just taking some of their previous paper forms and turning them into digital forms. So what we did there.
Yeah, and the big limitation, the reason we request, people are probably saying, well, if Iron Sights is out there, why wasn't everybody just using that? Most of these search and rescue teams are not federal USAR teams that we were working with. So they didn't have the Garmins to be able to collect the data in it. And then there's a pretty steep learning curve with the use of that capability. It's not just like creating something and capturing it on a cell phone. And then there's a lot of back-end work that has to be done to sync that data when you come out from the field into something that a decision maker can make sense of. So this one, I think, was collected. This is actually an aggregate. So this is a model where we combined the crowdsourced data. So that's how you see there's this many rescues made, because over 8,134 rescues were adjudicated through the use of that crowdsourcing platform that I talked about. That was collecting the SOS requests. It's a pretty big number. That's a lot when you think about it in terms of those individual. And these were like the total requests that were still outstanding at the time that the snapshot was taken. And then we were also able to integrate into here. You can see that there's some basic things that we attempted to align with some of the USAR field data coming in about those different rescues. In some cases, you could bring in things like hospital data, open shelter data. Again, these data sources were essentially derived from that Highfeld data that I talked about earlier. But what the other nice thing that you can do with that, if you're working in disaster and incident, if you're a GIS person, is clip that data and amend that data to include attributes, such as status information, open and closed.
In other words, don't map where the hospitals are. We know where the hospitals are. We put a lot of time and effort into mapping our infrastructure in the United States. Just add a field for status, red, yellow, green. Green meaning totally open, yellow meaning open but not great, and red meaning don't bring people here. And what we see in the crowdsourcing community or even in the responder community is a lack of awareness that we know where the hospitals are. You don't need to go and look that up or plot it. We know where those things are. Yep, from the back.
Is that data live? Like say a hospital that reaches capacity,
Right.
closed.
So that's what's not in place, is there's no national system for updating level of service. Even though we put all that effort into the mapping part, there's not necessarily a platform yet for that. So I guess what I was suggesting is don't map it, build a platform now, not during the disaster, and just put a little status field on there and some comments and off you go.
Basically, you could clip the data and then amend that data to include the actual live attribute information.
Yeah.
The federal government is most likely not going to be able to invest in maintaining a status on, say, every single fire station in the country, every single hospital. Why is that? Because ultimately, they don't even own this data. all of these data that come into this Highfield program, the stewards are from across the federal, state, local community. A lot of the data is even licensed through private entities such as like Dun & Bradstreet. So kind of maintaining that perspective of sort of why isn't the government doing that for you is essentially the rationale behind it. But that being said, you can still achieve that status level information like what I shared with you there. And that was probably the number one. Do you mind going back to the, sorry.
There we go.
There. This was the number one request that we were getting from search and rescue and other public health and others was, I don't care about where the hospitals are. I don't care about where the pharmacies are. I need to know which ones are opened and closed. Right, and that was the imperative. Yes.
In Houston, they use EM Resource,
Mm-hmm.
and that status is done by the Southeast Texas Regional Pharmacy Council. So every entity that touches public health, the SFA,
Yeah.
what was open or closed via that system. That data is shared out through an API to the consumer. So that data set was available in the open world.
What type of data did it
It
contain?
tells you this current status of the facility. Are they on the verge?
What type of facility? Sorry.
Hospitals.
Hospital specifically. Okay. Okay.
All clinics, all.
Great.
There's 140. Yeah. So that data is readily available. It's just, it goes back to being able to pull that resource and understand it's there.
Yeah.
But all that data is in the host state of Texas. Every hospital tells you what their current status is right now. It's live.
Yeah.
It's just an API you have to consider from the resource.
So like that's a really great example. The challenge of the reality of that during actually Harvey though was that they didn't know that existed in a lot of
It's
cases.
the same thing in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico
Right.
uses the EM system and WebUFC. The same thing with 67 hospitals.
Oh, through WebUFC.
It's owned
Okay.
by all the same collaboration.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But all those 67 hospitals in Puerto Rico were also on the system. And their statuses were being updated. If they couldn't update the status because of communication, then they went to San Juan. San Juan updated the status.
So I guess one of the points that Justin's getting to is in this disaster space, but I think actually more often than not, even in our missing person case, we have a real problem where people have access to stuff and we don't even know them. We don't know they have it and we're not able to communicate. So there's a technology problem that we can try with our open data portals and websites to make it more accessible, but it's through workshops like this where we start to make those connections. And I don't think you can remove the people element from it.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I'll be honest with you, I sat on the FEMA's geospatial coordination calls every day with Mike Wimette and others from the state of Texas, and nobody ever mentioned that was available.
Yeah,
Right.
and
So it's
the
just,
thing
it's
Paul
that
and I had
connection
a
point.
lively discussion about is, let's go look at Puerto Rico. I sat in the SF2 and also helped the SF8. And there was data sets being done up on what we call the third floor, the FEMA floor.
Right.
That data set never went anywhere. Well, come to find out, the 3 different floors never talked to each other. And when they talked to each other, they became this pigeonhole that you can't have the data.
Exactly.
Well, the CIO had his own data set because he had a custom GIS group because he didn't get along with the Department of Agriculture. And this person didn't get along with this person, so you get these pigeonholes. And then all the data is not there, and we're trying to reach out to Paul. It's like,
Yeah.
do you know where this is at?
Yeah.
Nobody, they never talked to each other, and they're in exactly the same building, 50 feet from each other.
Don was working under emergency support function 12.
Yes, I mean, I'm part of that. I didn't know about that.
Right.
So Don's coming onto Slack asking me what we have.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, I've got photos. He's all right, good, I'll take that. But you know, what else is going on out there? So it became this really weird hybrid social network. And the problem is there's other people doing the same thing over there. And so
The collaboration, like in Fort Bend County, Southwest Houston, we had 119 UAV flights with it while the weather was bad.
Mhm.
We also gridded with manned flights and also we used in situ scanning. We had all their data set, almost 3 terabytes of data. But we never were able to push that out because only